Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's SBDX webinar, Board Governance and Founder-Led Public Companies. We're delighted to have you joining us today, as well as our esteemed panelists. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. We are a small organization dedicated to education and networking programs for boards of directors. We encourage you to join our mailing list to hear more about our future events. Today's session will be an hour and a half long. We will have a great discussion with our panelists, but I do encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom. I will be feeding those to the moderator and the panelists throughout the session to make sure that we address all questions that bubble up from this great discussion we're about to have. We will be recording today's session so that it will be available on our website after the fact. And I'm very pleased today to introduce our moderator, Mark Lonergan. He is the founder and managing partner of Lonergan Partners. And I'm actually going to pass the baton to you, Mark, in order to kick things off.
Thank you, Nancy. By the way, I'd like to take issue with Nancy's description of SBDX as a small organization. It turns out it may not be a large number of people who run the organization, but in terms of impact, it's massive. So thank you for sponsoring us this morning and being part of. I'm excited to get started on the panel discussion this morning. In conversations with Nancy a little while ago, we learned that this is setting a record for the largest number of participants in a panel discussion in SBDX history. Over 250 people are said to be in attendance in this morning's discussion. Many of you are public company board members yourselves, and so we invite you to join in the discussion and listen in and make this the best kind of event it can be. But if it is as popular as Nancy describes, one of the best we've ever done, it can only be for two reasons. The quality of the panel, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a moment, and also the importance and the urgency of the topic. The topic, of course, is board governance in public companies led by founder CEOs. And so with that, anxious to get started and looking forward to the discussion with all of you. Let me ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves briefly, if we can, starting with Christine Russell.
Hi, I have been a career CFO in Silicon Valley for many, many years. I've been at 6 publicly traded companies, 2 PE-owned firms. I've done everything in the market areas from disk drives to batteries, application servers, semiconductor, IP, and I've been a director on 4 public company boards.
Good. Thank you, Christine. Maureen Farrell.
Hi, so I've been a longtime journalist, most recently for about 8 years at the Wall Street Journal, where I've covered IPOs, capital markets. And during my time there, I wrote a book on WeWork. It's called The Cult of We, that came out this summer, looking at, among other things, corporate governance or the lack of it at WeWork. Excited to join the panel. I'm actually going to be joining the New York Times next month. So I'm on a bit of a break in between jobs.
By the way, for those of you in the audience who haven't read The Cult of We, I will describe it as the best business book I ever read, and certainly the #1 business book in America in 2021. It's an examination of the company WeWork and its founder, Adam Neumann. And if you haven't read it yet, it's available, Maureen, on Amazon. Is that true?
Yes.
Good. So please feel free.
Thank you, Mark.
Ken Goldman.
Yeah, I was just commenting. I was thinking, first of all, if you notice this cast of characters here, I'm in a minority, so let us know that. And Maureen, by the way, I know many of the folks involved with including the venture guys and Vivek and some of the others. So anyway, a lot of connections here. And also I read the Journal and the Times both somehow, some way. A long time, like Christine, I have a long time career as a CFO for a number of companies. I think I was on 7 public companies as CFO. And I'll talk about later as both founder-driven and non-founder-driven. I've been on, if I add it all up, probably over 40 boards on 5 publics right now. I think, Maggie, you're on 5 too. I get a lot of grief about that, actually. I'm currently running a family office as well for Eric Schmidt. I was involved with Cornell on their board, as well as I'm limited partner in the Golden State Warriors.
Thank you, Ken. By the way, one of the things that makes Ken differentiated from many others is that he has sat on a number of boards chaired by or involved with independent CEOs as well as founder CEOs, which makes his participation, everybody here has done some of that. The topic that we have for today, Ken is in an unusually good position to be able to judge the differences, the nuances in terms of board service in both kinds of environments. Finally, Maggie Wilderrader.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And it's a privilege to be with Christine, Maureen, and Ken. I've had the good fortune to run both startups as a CEO. I was the fourth woman to take a company public in the US back in the early 90s. I also ran a Fortune 500 for 12 years, Frontier Communications. And on the board side, I've sat on 51 corporate boards. So Ken, you're getting close.
I said, oh, wait a minute, I said over 40.
Yeah.
I stopped counting at 40.
Well, maybe I should say close to 60 then. But anyway, I've sat on 36 public company boards in my career, going on my first public company board when I was 28 years old. And I've sat on 15 private company boards. I adore both. I think they both are amazing platforms for companies to be successful, and same with shareholders. Today, I sit on the Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Board, the Costco Board, Lyft Rideshare, Sana Biotechnology, and I also chair the DocuSign Board. On the private side, I'm on the Legends Hospitality Board, the Sonoma Biotherapeutics Board, TripActions, and Tanium in the cybersecurity space. I do senior advisory work today for Blackstone, for Sixth Street Partners, which was a spin out of the growth fund from TPG. I'm on the Ateros. I'm an owner there, plus they're a private equity company in the TMT space. I work with Julie Sweet as an advisor on the Accenture leadership team, Bank of America with Brian Moynihan, their CEO, on their Women's Council for their top 45 women in the bank. And I'm a senior advisor and investor in Okta. And then last, but probably the most important thing on my resume is I have 6 grandchildren. I'm married to the same guy for 46 years. Jay is my my love and my partner. I have 2 great children, and I hope they bring me even more grandchildren.
I would add, we have our first grandchild. She's only 4 months old. So in this case, I have a long way to catch up to you, Maggie, but we do have our first ever grandkid, and she's a little, not quite 4 months old. So it's our first.
That's awesome. I have 3 that are COVID grandchildren. So 2 are 6. I have twins at 6 months and a little girl at 5 months.
Wow.
Wow. Well, good. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm Mark Lonergan. Many of you know me as the managing partner, the founder at Lonergan Partners. We're a CEO and board and senior management recruiting firm here in Silicon Valley. I'm the former managing partner at Heidrick & Struggles here in Northern California. And like Christine Russell, she's being too modest, I'm the former president and chairman of SVDX, the group that's sponsoring us today. So what a pleasure to be able to get on with you guys and to support the mission that Nancy is now leading with Dan Siciliano at SVDX. Well, with that, let's get into the survey if we can, Nancy. The next slide.
Sure.
Thank you. I thought the best way to start off this morning was to do that with a response from many of the people who were participating as audience members in today's session. We did a survey over the summer of some 1,500 public company board directors, and we asked them questions about founder-led companies in order to learn what we could, not just about the topic in general, but the topic as relates to Silicon Valley. And by the way, for those of you who aren't clear on this, just to give you an idea of how important it is in Silicon Valley, there have been 41 IPOs in Silicon Valley, according to our records, since 2018. 85% of those, roughly 35, have been led by founder CEOs. This is, if it's not the past, it's certainly the future of Silicon Valley. Something like 60 out of the Lonergan and Silicon Valley 150 now are founder-led companies, publicly traded, led by the founders who started the company in the first place. So this is a topic of great interest, and there's an awful lot of discussion going on right now about it. The 1,500 people that this thing went to, most of these people who responded were from Silicon Valley. All were from Northern California in one sense or another. And this is interesting. 75% of the people who responded to our survey have personal experience as board members in founder-led companies, both public and private. And either that's becoming the rule, not the exception, or the people who had that experience were especially motivated to respond to our survey. Whichever the reason, the responses were pretty interesting. We can go to the next survey slide. So one of the things we asked for were just comments from the people who are responding to our survey. And we bunched those comments into various categories where we found a lot of people whose comments agreed. And the most important thing we learned in that was that being a board member in a CEO founder-led company is just more challenging. It's harder work than being a board member in some other kind of a company led by a professional CEO. We heard some great comments. The first one is my favorite. All the same director skills are required. You just need to do them 10 times better. I don't know what that means exactly, but it's still a lot of fun. A lot of the people who responded to our survey said that soft skills and EQ are a big requirement for board directors, much more than it would be for an independent or non-founder CEO. You need to set up a relationship of trust in order to have coaching and negotiation and persuasion happening with somebody fundamentally who has voting control of the company and whose pleasure you serve on the board of directors. It said that directors need to offer people who are inexperienced as public company board directors have a more difficult time in companies that are led by a founder CEO. And perhaps one of the reasons for that is found in the fourth or fifth comments on this, that often you have to supplement a CEO founder either for functional expertise or for marketplace expertise that CEO founder may not have as compared to the independent CEO. Again, these are just comments that were bunched up from the thing. Moving on, in the survey, there were certain trends that developed that were very clear. What were the advantages? What were the positives that these board directors saw from founder-led companies? More than a third of our respondents said that CEO founders are more innovative than their professional CEO counterparts. Half of them said that founder CEOs are less motivated by financial metrics than their counterparts in other companies, which might be seen as an advantage or a disadvantage based on your point of view. We have two CFOs on the panel today. Maybe they can comment on that one themselves. And then as a recruiter, this is the one that hurts me, 57% agree that founder CEOs are less effective at growing and keeping top quality talent. They have people on their management teams. The question is, do they have the same quality of talent that their professional independent CEO counterparts have in other companies? Last slide. What are the downsides? What were the challenges? The number one on this should not be a surprise to anybody listening today. 91% of the board members said that their founder CEOs don't want to talk about CEO succession. And if you are going to sit on the board of a CEO founder-led company, management succession planning is not something that's going to show up on the agenda. Just not going to happen. 83% agree that they micromanage more than their counterparts, that CEO founders tend to be very wrapped up in the details. And finally, more than 2/3 said that CEO founders are more likely to surround themselves by yes men and women, folks who are less likely to challenge them than their CEO professional independent counterparts. And those are just some of the results. By the way, all of the surveys are going to be featured on sbdx.org, which is the SBDX website, also on the Lonergan Partners website. Would invite you to take a look at that if you have an interest in learning more. But
Hey, Mark.
having
Yeah.
said that, let me start
Mark?
the discussion. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, the last two, not to sort of, I mean, you said to keep this open, but yeah, the last two I don't necessarily agree with, just from my perspective on the
Sure.
prior charts. So, particularly on the ethics, I have seen zero, I've never seen any issue relative to ethical behavior that's a risk of being in a founder-driven company. So I guess in my own experience, I'm gonna violently disagree with that one.
Yep. Well, it's interesting. Some of that was controversial, and I don't want to imply that most people felt that way because they didn't. But then the question was, well, what does ethics mean, and what kind of decisions are we talking about? I'm not really clear. The question in general for the other observations, I'll open it up to the crew. But Maggie, does that kind of match your understanding of the difference between an independent public company CEO and the other kind?
Well, I do think that it's hard to compartmentalize everybody into a bucket, right? I think all of these founders are individuals with different skills, capabilities, and experiences, and they're not perfect, right? They've got flaws just like anybody else, and I do think that it depends on if they're also lifelong learners, if they want to expand those horizons beyond just what they already know. And I find that some are courageous, so they'll put people on the boards like Ken or me that have a lot of experience. And some don't necessarily want to have that courage on their board. So one of the questions should have been about how controlling are they? Because I think control really dictates whether they're going to keep this lid on everything that happens and more rubber stamp things versus do they want to grow and learn? And Ken, I don't know about you, but I've always self-selected with founder-led companies to go for those that really want to open things up and listen and learn. That's not to say they're always going to agree with everything I say or other board members say, but they're open to the possibilities. I've had some founders I've interviewed with that I've said this, I'm not for you. I am an acquired taste on a board. I know a lot. So, and I've walked away from very high profile companies that are founder led because those when you're reminded the third time in the interview, when you bring up a certain risk, that they do have majority vote. So it's really advisory. That's when I say, you know what, this isn't going to work for you and I.
So that's
Let me, I just want to bring up, because I saw a note from Liz, and I think just to sort of point, I just want to make a differentiation. I think the control and dual class versus founder driven are very important clarifications. I think control in a private scenario is very challenging versus control in a public scenario. And I know some people are thinking about some very public situations, and I know both of them pretty well actually, in which there was an ethical issues, but they were they were in a private setting. And having control in a private setting is very different than having control in a public setting. I'll just make that quick differentiation just to follow up what Maggie said.
And
Well, you were gonna say something. Yeah.
just to jump in there, I mean, taking the WeWork example, obviously the ethics there are a lot of challenges, and as you said, Ken, I mean, it wasn't a private company setting, but it did seem like time and time again the directors there from all of our conversations we had understanding what happened at board meetings, they would grumble a lot about, does Adam Newman need a private plane? And do we need to spend $65 million? But he wants one. We disagree, but no one voted against it. And it seemed like in so many situations, the defense of the board that they had for themselves was, why are we going to vote against it? We don't have power. Like, he has control. So it's just, it's meaningless. And then just one other thing on that. I mean, I see what you mean about private versus public companies, it being different, but it does seem like the true trend is these founders getting control earlier and earlier. And it's hard for their investors to say, and that was in the case of Adam Newman, but it seems like it's happening time and time again. He's like, how can Benchmark tell me they're not going to give me control when you let Uber or Travis Kalanick have control, Evan Spiegel. So it does feel like we're in this place where founders, are seeing other founders getting it in the private markets, and they're going for the privately control before they go public.
Christine, from your standpoint, as a longtime public company CFO, what's your sense? Are these folks led? Are founder CEOs less likely to be driven by financial mandates? Are they ethical? Are they, what's your sense of it?
Yeah, well, I completely agree with Maggie. There's all flavors of founders, and there's all flavors of professional CEOs too. I'm casting my mind back, thinking about professional managers versus founders. A lot of them have not been successful with the companies when they succeeded the founders. A couple that I think stand out are John Morgridge at Cisco and Eric Schmidt, of course, but they also partnered with founders. But in terms of the positive side of founder CEOs, they do tend to be laser focused on the company. And you talked about what drives them. This is their life work. This is their legacy. They are incredibly knowledgeable about the technology, the markets, the product cycles, the competition, and this is why the employees follow them. So on the negative side, most of them have not developed a wide view of business. I think this is why some of them can go astray from a moral compass. Let me give you one example. When I think of the Theranos case, I have a teeny bit of sympathy for them. And I'll tell you why that is. I've been at companies before where it looked like the product was not going to be able to come to market, where there was some question about it. And either, the founder and the board can throw up their hands and say, we give up, or they can soldier on. And in many cases, they were able to overcome the difficulties while they, threw out the first solution and then found a new solution. In some cases, they weren't able to. And in the cases where they weren't able to, I'm sure there could be accusations of fraud or malfeasance. So it's a difficult path to walk.
Got it.
Let me just add something on to, just to keep things fun, actually. I did interview with Elizabeth twice, actually several times. When I left Yahoo in 2017, around then, she was looking for both either a CFO or board members. And my comment to her was, it's hard to be a CFO for a company that has no revenue. So it's not really going to, whet my appetite. Might be interested in board, and then I had a number, which I'm not going to name, a number of their board members try to convince me to join. And the comment I made to her, and I'll make this to anyone, the issue there to me, and I said this to her, was they had, and I don't feel bad for the investors at all there. I just don't feel bad because they all had FOMO, in my opinion. And at least I should say many of them did. And they didn't necessarily understand the business well. And they had, board members, they had investors and board members that weren't traditional venture capitalists. And when I talked to some of my traditional venture capitalist friends in the healthcare industry, they all stayed far away from it. Now, whether the technology worked or didn't work, I'm not going to comment because that's beyond my capability. But I do know at the end, they had some very reputable people involved. And so, the challenge there is unique. I would just say this relative to the discussion at hand today. What you really want to have is board members that really, at least either understand the business really well, or can bring skill sets so they really understand the business well. It can contribute, and frankly, be able to say no. And I'm sure we'll get into it. But if you feel you can't say no in a polite way, and then have your position recognized, then you have the ultimate weapon, which is to leave. It's very simple, and you don't want to put your reputation. At least I'm not going to put my reputation behind something I really don't agree with.
Yeah,
So-
one of the things that I just wanted to comment on, because I think it is important, is, again, founders are all different. I had the privilege to hear Elizabeth Holmes speak early on when she was sort of a sensation. And as a woman leader of companies over my career, I have a pretty good sniff test on genuine versus not. I've never created sort of a uniform for myself, or, wanted to have this appearance image of who I was. I wanted people to see that I was genuine in who I was. And I always suspected her not being genuine. And I actually mentioned it. I was at a conference with a bunch of CEOs from Fortune 500 companies, and everybody was like, ooh and wow and yay. And I was like, eh.
Hey, Maggie,
sure.
I was at that same conference. I know exactly which one you're referring to, at a major investment bank.
Yes, it was. And I was the
And
only one
CEO there introduced her. I remember it well.
And I said to that CEO afterwards, I said, excuse my French, that's the biggest bunch of BS I've ever heard. And he said, you are totally wrong. Oh, light the world on fire, blah, blah, blah. And then when the whole thing went down, that CEO sent me a dozen roses. That's what I want you to know. But I started my career at 22 years old, working for a founder-led company in technology back in the 70s. And I worked there for 12 years. And one of the things that CEO taught me is, he was inspirational. He was tenacious. He was a disruptor, very strong-willed, but he was also genuine, right? And he had this gift that I look for in founders, is he knew what he was really good at, and he knew what he didn't know. And what he did is he surrounded himself with people that knew things he didn't know, that he trusted. And this is in the 70s. Of his top 10 direct reports, 5 were women.
Wow.
Of which one he married. So he loved us all. But I was running the US, European, and Canadian marketplace for the company. I grew market share from 15% to 85% in the cable television industry before I was 35 years old. Wow. So he took chances on great talent. And I'm still in touch with all of those amazing women that I worked with back then. But I do think that foundation for me really helped me, gravitate to founders. I like founder-led companies.
I'd like to go back to what Ken just said, and it's pretty interesting. The nuclear option, Ken, according to you, is that the director can quit. The nuclear option in an independent CEO-led company is that you can fire the CEO. There's a tremendous difference that occurs to me in terms of the power base, or at least the degree of freedom that a board member has in one over the other. Quitting may not be a nuclear option. It's more like a seppuku. And so the question is, how do you influence the founder when the founder needs to hear hard things? I mean, Maureen, you talked about it at WeWork. You've managed, or you've written on all kinds of public and private equity-backed markets. What's your view on that?
It's interesting. I mean, it does feel like, and obviously WeWork is the extreme example, but that directors in some cases can feel a little like powerless when the CEOs take the more extreme example. I mean, I'll give you another one that's been very much in the public eye that we all know is Snap. I mean, that one I do find really interesting when you think about founder control, because I mean, Evan Spiegel got the extreme version of that. The company was kind of, a mess at the beginning when it first went public. And I mean, there were even reports, I didn't write them, so I can't, this one in particular, but like that he would be on his cell phone the whole time and like not even listening at the board meetings when they went public. But then it also illustrates the flip side. I mean, if he did not have founder control, he probably would have been out pretty quickly. I mean, the stock tanked immediately, but you can kind of see the benefits of it. I mean, he figured out somehow how to turn the company around, and it's like now it's a true, maybe not like it could be a rival long term to Facebook and others. So I don't know. That's just one thing. It seemed like the board never had very much control over him, but investors would have thrown him out. The board would have thrown him out very quickly.
Well, as an outsider, it occurs to me that I've learned, among other things, he's surrounding himself with better people now than he had before.
Yes.
Isn't that true? And which is Ken's point, right? And Maggie's point that the founder CEO's willingness to surround her or himself with smart people is a pretty important marker, isn't it? Maggie, that was what I heard from you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I look to see when I look to join a founder-led board, I look to see who are the other board members on the board, right? And is there courage around the boardroom to tell the truth? And with founders, you have to be persuasive, right? They might be more locked in on certain issues than others. And you sort of have to try to put yourself in their shoes and have the conversation from that perspective as well. But to Ken's point, I think directors always have a choice. We always get a vote. We either vote in a public environment, we can vote to remove and replace a CEO. And in the private environment, we can vote to remove and replace ourselves.
Yeah.
So I think that board members have to, look at themselves as well in those situations. And a lot of people join boards because it's prestigious to do so. So they want to be on boards, but you don't want to be on boards at all costs. It should just be like any job you take. You do your homework before you join a company. And if it doesn't work, you go someplace else.
Now, I'm on 4 public founder-driven companies. So I know well, and actually in Fortinet, I was CFO when I came back as a board member. And actually, I was looking at the screen before. It's an all-time high at over 300. So something's going right, I guess. But I think the toughest challenge I have seen in general is succession planning. And and without being too specific, because I know it's going to be public here, you do have the challenge when you do think, when CEOs say, well, I'm thinking of leaving, and then they change their mind, and you go back and forth. And I would say that is the toughest challenge, to think about succession planning. Obviously, Maureen talked a lot about it at We, but that is a tough one. Because frankly, some of the CEO founders, they can be schizoid. They think they want to leave, but they really don't want to leave. And how do you handle that in a way? I said nuclear options, actually both nuclear options, but they're really never done. At least I haven't seen them done. Where if the board fundamentally disagrees, they can leave, and the CEO knows they'll be without a board. So you do have that in theory, or the CEO in theory can fire some of you. So you have that. So there's always this sort of yin and yang on, control oriented. There's a real big difference, by the way, a relative big difference between founder driven and control, dual class stock, however you want to achieve it, versus founder driven, where you don't necessarily have full control.
There's an interesting analysis. Dave Larker at Stanford GSB at the Rock Center, he calls these family-owned businesses. And he said there's not any difference between this and any other kind of family-owned business. He said going back to Ford Motor Company and DuPont, even Dcso is not a new invention. It's been around for a long, long time. But he made the point last year that over 90% of the founder-led, founder CEO companies exit through a sale, either to private equity or to another company, that they almost never do succession planning, ever. It's never, with some exceptions, and he points out several of the exceptions come in cases where the CEO founder has a severe medical crisis that prevents them from keeping control of the company that they're in charge of. And so that question of CEO succession is pretty interesting. I don't know, Christine, how do you deal with that when you're dealing with those founders?
Yeah, replacing a founder or even replacing an incumbent CEO are probably the hardest things directors have to do. I think you have to exhibit a lot of patience. One way I can think of a company I was associated with that we handled it is as part of the normal process of the board, one of the directors, I think it was the lead independent director, brought up the idea of succession planning. And the CEO was a little bit, taken aback, but then we brought it up gently again at every single board meeting until finally, the CEO said, well, I'm thinking maybe, Joe Bag of Donuts would be the right person to follow me, or if we go outside, it could be this kind of a person. And that actually worked out well, but it probably took 9 months. So you have to be prepared to be patient unless there's a crisis going on, which is a totally different situation. And to the point, I think, Ken, you were talking about the exits. There's some great data from the Wharton School. And in a survey of exits of public companies, basically the founder CEO-led companies outpaced in performance in terms of capital efficiency, time to exit values, and ROI. They outpaced the professional CEO-led companies. So that gives us something to think about as well.
By the way, one of the things that we couldn't comment on in today, we just had too many slides, that when the board directors were asked where they put their personal money, over half of them said that they have a preference for founder-led companies, which tells me that when they're voting with their wallets as opposed to ISS, that their interest is in finding companies led by founder CEOs.
Yeah, it's funny. You're not perceived independent if you have too much ownership. And as a good venture capitalist friend of mine, and I'm sure everyone knows here, John Doe once said, "No conflict, no interest." And what he meant by that is, where else do you have more alignment if you have a big investment in a company, whereas the CEO, or whether it's the venture capitalist or major shareholders, or the founder who has a big interest, you have just tremendous alignment when you have a big interest, a financial interest in the company, which is why I like when companies really want board members to own stock, because I think board members should own stock in the companies.
Sure.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think having ownership in companies levels the playing field in terms of dealing with founders as well. If you're an owner of that company, in addition to them, they know you have a stake in the game in a different way. No doubt about it. But I also think that I have several boards that I sit on that there are co-founders. It's not just one person. And that does help on the succession planning side, because you have almost a de facto succession plan in place. So when I interview for those types of boards, I'm looking at those co-founders as one could be a successor to that CEO. And is that possible? And in many cases, they have as much at stake as the person who's sort of the outside face for that company. So I do think, and in family businesses, it's generational. I've sat on many family company boards that were founder families when they go public, and you wind up with children on the boards as well. And a lot of times those generations, the second or third generation, are successors as well. But I think bringing it up, as Christine said, sometimes you have to say things 7 times, 7 different ways for people to actually hear it, digest it, and do something about it. And when you have a lot of grandchildren, I get that. I do it all the time. But I do. I think
you're not old enough to have all these grandchildren. I don't know what's going on.
I know. It's divine intervention, Ken.
She got married when she was 15.
I know. I think so.
But I do think that founders need to process information, right? A lot of them are processors. A lot of them are technology oriented. They want to process things, and they like control. So they want to react to something not in the moment. And I think we have to be able to lean back when we need to and lean in when we need to.
Well, that goes to my next set of questions, and this is for all of you. There was a clear indication that do not join a founder-led company board if you're an inexperienced board member, or if you don't have the EQ, what you call, Christine, the patience to kind of deal with I'm using my own word, the kabuki that maybe a founder CEO might introduce into a board governance situation. Is that your finding as well? I mean, what kinds of skills do you use there that you, maybe muscles that you don't use in other kinds of public companies that you sit on? Not everybody all at once. I'll start with.
I think you asked Christine, so I'm
Maybe we'll go
quiet.
for
You did? You did? Sorry.
Yeah, he asked you, Chris.
Yeah. One of the things I find useful is every director has a different role on the board as far as their persona. And I am usually the mom. And so I'm very non-threatening, so I'm the one who's sitting there patting the hand of the CEO founder or explaining things in great detail. And I found that to be very useful, rather than relying on a formal board meeting. We do a lot of chit chat, and sometimes I'll introduce a chit chat. We talk about our families. We sympathize with what the founder CEO is going through. And once you've kind of established that atmosphere in the boardroom, then the founder CEO feels more comfortable sharing their deepest concerns and worries. They know they're not going to be attacked. Yes, it might be like your mom telling you did something wrong, don't do it again. But it won't be a situation where you need to worry about losing your job.
Sure.
Yeah, I think you're not supposed to have an ego on a board anyway, but I would say you should have probably even less of an ego. And I've worked both. Actually, I was thinking about some of the CEOs I work with. I've worked for like 4 CEOs, and I'm thinking about folks like TJ Rogers, Tom Siebels. I've worked for some, and some others, in which it's hard to have a big ego as a board member if you work for some of these very outspoken founder CEOs. Not to mention some of the other companies that we all know about as well in the Valley here. So I think that the EQ, IQ, as well as ego, there's a fine balance there when you're particularly on a very heavily driven, founder-driven company, and it's just a different. And I'm sure Maureen has some good examples she can give us in some of her work.
Well, I don't mean to switch gears here, but I just wanted to just go back to one of the things that Christine was saying. And just in terms of being the mom on the board and that role, Maggie and Christine, I'm just curious. I mean, clearly most boards, when you look at any stat, are largely, and I know this is beginning to change slowly, are largely male dominated. And how do you, how is the dynamic in terms of giving advice to the CEO, being heard on the board? Like, how do those dynamics play out? I think just being probably in many boards, minority women, largely male CEOs, is that, I don't know, do you feel like there's struggles here getting your voice heard? How does that play out?
So, I've been serving on boards for a long time, and I've also run big and small companies. So I don't play a mom role in the boardroom. I would say the role I play is more of a trusted advisor. And I spend a lot of time with the CEOs of the companies I serve on outside of board meetings. Even during COVID, I would go have dinner with the CEO, outdoor restaurant. But I think having those offline discussions can help you tee up issues, or maybe talk about issues that you don't necessarily want to bring up with a whole group the first time. Or it gives the CEO that opportunity to bounce things off of you that he or she might not want to do with a whole room of people. So I think trusted advisors are really important. It does come with experience. So I understand having a lot of experience people would think would be good to go on a founder-led board. But I think experience could be working at a founder-led company and understanding how that works. It doesn't necessarily have to be board service. And I also think it's the DNA of the board member. I'm very courageous. I'm a courageous person, but I'm also a servant leader. I have good EQ and good IQ. So, and I know when to lean in and I know when to lean back. And I think those are just skills of human beings. They're not necessarily just skills of great, board members who have sat on a lot of boards. But, and I also bring things up not declaratory. I talk in questions. I talk to seek to understand, which I also think allows founder CEOs to not feel like they're being backed into a corner.
I think to add a little bit to that, we're particularly like both Christine and Maggie is you have the gravitas of having had operating roles. And obviously, Maggie, you don't need me to speak for yourself, but having been a CEO for a number of companies, being CFO for a number of companies, and when you have operating experience, you have a little bit more, ability. The founder has a little bit more. They see more credibility in you than if you haven't been in their shoes, so to speak. So that's one of the things that really helps you gain their confidence. And having it's funny having dinners outside. I'm a lead director in one company called GoPro, and I work very closely with Nick, and we've had a lot of heart-to-heart conversations, which I think have been, even though he's chairman, I'm lead director, and so we split the duties. And I know it's one of your questions later if we get to it, but it helps out a lot, and he runs ideas by me and so forth, and I work the executive session and get back to him, whatever. And so that's one of the ways. And I don't know, it's funny. I always, whether it's founder-driven or whatever, you can always find bad examples of things that go wrong. I don't care who it is, but I happen to like the passion, the motivation, the commitment of founders. Again, I was adding it up. I worked for CFO of 4 founder-driven companies on a board of 4 founder-driven. And I can tell you, they feel their whole life. I don't want to say whole life, but so much of their identity, so much of their reputation and credibility is on the success of their company.
Yeah, Maureen, to answer your question, in my career, yes, I have often been the only woman in the room, but I tend to regard other directors or other management as people, not as men or women. And it's funny that as I look back on my career, people ask me, they say, well, weren't you like disrespected or insulted from time to time? And I say, well, no, but I probably was. But as my husband explains to me, I'm so unobservant. I get so laser focused on a view that I am totally unobservant of other things going on around me. So I probably was insulted, but I never knew it, which was very helpful because I just forged ahead.
Yeah, I can totally relate to Christine on that. I never went into a boardroom and focused on my feelings getting hurt or not. But I grew up in an era where Sheryl Sandberg talks about leaning in. I mean, for goodness sakes, we were laying on the table back in the 70s and 80s. I mean, for God's sake. So you were just in a male-dominated environment. It was normal for us, right? And so I do think having flexibility, and I agree. We're, as Christine said, we're peers around the table. And we all have different perspectives, different backgrounds, different points of view. And it's that collective wisdom that you just want to bring the best out in everyone. But there have been dysfunctional boards. There's no doubt about that. And as a board member, you try to make changes so they get more functional. But if you can't make that change, again, we get to vote with our feet in terms of whether we stay or go.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge in a lot of these companies is the transition from private to public. And when do the venture capitalists go off? How do you recruit, quote unquote, new independent board members that can really contribute? How do you keep some of the institutional knowledge of the prior investors? And again, I'm very, I have a strong view that many the companies in Silicon Valley have been very well driven by boards. They're very passionate about them. And then when I read about some of the companies that particularly, board members that I've been involved in don't go on boards for prestige. They don't go on board to make money. They really go on, at least the ones that I've been involved in, they go on board because they really believe in the company. And I think that is why I've been so pleased to have grown up, so to speak, in my career in the Silicon Valley area in technology.
It's interesting. We're talking about the composition of boards and what it takes to be successful. But remember, one of the comments that we heard from the vast majority of respondents was that CEO founders have a hard time finding independent thinking, high quality, credible management team members, and then keeping them in position. And what they didn't say, and I'm just reading into it a little bit, is that often they have their posse, 5, 10, 15 people who were there in the early days, who they remain committed to and promote into positions of importance, who may or may not have the skills necessary to, as the company scales. And the question now becomes, talking, Ken, about your comment about being tough-minded and being able to say no, how do you stand up in front of that CEO founder and gently but firmly inform him or her that maybe it's time for, Arnie to go? Maybe it's time to rethink the way the management team is either structured or the quality of the people who are filling those roles.
Well, if I can give an anecdote in a minute here, I remember I wasn't on the board. I was CFO of Cypress Semiconductor. TJ Rogers was on there, and there was one of his, loyal members of his team. And I remember, I'll just say it doesn't really matter. Pierre Lamont said, "Hey, TJ, I don't think this guy is making it." And so he said, "I think, TJ, you need to move on from him." Another board meeting came, and Pierre said, "TJ, what have you done?" TJ said, "Well, I'm thinking about whatever." Another board meeting, same thing. Pierre finally said, "If you don't get rid of him, I'm going to do it myself." And so, and by the way, Pierre meant it. And so, and all of a sudden, that who was going to go unnamed, that ex head of basic quality, whatever, he ended up departing the company. But so yeah, sometimes you do have. It's funny. Some of the hardest nosed CEOs have the softest, underbelly for their folks. So sometimes big barks are little bites, and by the way, vice versa. Sybase at work, Mark Hoffman, I think, Maggie, you probably remember Mark. He had a low bark, big bite. If he really didn't think he could do the job, man, you were gone. I mean, all of a sudden I said, "Where happened to that person?" "Oh, he's no longer working with us." "Well, geez, I thought." And so it's interesting how, the CEOs that I've worked for, this is as a CFO, some of them have big bark, little bite, or just the opposite. And in terms of something Christine talked about a little bit about having the loyal group around you. But I have seen folks like TJ Rogers had a very loyal group, very loyal, mutual loyalty. And in another case, Mark Hoffman, if you didn't get the job done, he was cutthroat in terms of moving on.
Well, Maureen, you see this market. Do you see that as well, that CEO founders have their posses that they're hanging out with?
Yeah, completely. I mean, it just seems like I think the whole idea of the early people is like, it's really interesting to kind of find those people, and you can start to see, that it breeds discontent sometimes when it's people come in. I think that sometimes when people talk to me more, there's like the frustration of people who've been around them, and we're in an era, and I'm curious what you all think about this too. And it seems like it's only kind of accelerating beyond like the early people. But I saw someone in the chat asked about like the royal court around founders. I mean, it seems like we've moved more and more in a direction where founders are like celebrities. I mean, they literally have celebrities as hangers on, and I don't think it's just Adam Newman. I mean, it's an exciting time. There have been these huge companies built, and it's like American capitalism, like a wonderful things have been created, but it's like it kind of is dangerous, I think, with founders, especially, young ones. You have this like celebrity status, and how do you keep your head on, and how, as a director who has much more experience, help that person keep their head on?
So it's not just a pit crew, it's an entourage of people. By the way, we just, speaking as a firm, we just recruited a CFO into a public company here in Northern California. I'll leave the name out of it. but that person had 6 direct reports, each of whom were worth over $30 million each before this new CFO joined. And
Oops.
question of these folks aren't just on board. These folks are, in many cases, making some very serious money in those roles, right? As a result of the CEO founder's commitment to that. So I don't know
No.
where to go. Maggie?
Yeah. The royal court is a problem. It's really a problem. And I can share an anecdote with you with a company I was affiliated with that had to do with the founders' royal court, many of whom were co-founders or there at the time the company was founded. One problem was that when you recruit new people into the company who are not part of the royal court, the example will be a VP was hired to head up a capital allocation project that was very, very expensive. And he was given a person, like you say, one of these $30 million people. He was given a person to supervise who was part of the royal court. And the person who had been hired, the non-royal court person, was very competent, very good. I was able to observe that, but he could not control I'm going to call him the Duke. He could not control the Duke because the Duke once a week would go meet with the founder and tell him what a jerk his new boss was and undermined him constantly. Finally, after 1 year, the new recruit, the non-royal court guy resigned. And it was a loss. It was a big loss for the company. And the Duke got to go off merrily on his way, overspending and under-delivering. Now, the next question is, what can a director do about that?
That's the right question.
And there is, from a tactical point of view, one thing I've seen that actually did work in one case is after the directors identified the royal court, you need to do that first. We started asking the CEO founder to invite these people to the board meetings to present about their functional area of expertise and their plans and their goals. And then that person was open to the critique and advice of the board. And I can think of one case where the person presented and their presentation was so inadequate that they took on a lot of criticism from the board. And I will say that the CEO founder reacted pretty well to it. He kind of gulped a few times, and then he agreed that changes needed to be made.
Well, let's be clear, folks. Let's be clear in understanding that professional CEOs often have terrible teams as well. So this is not unique to the founder. But what we're hearing from many of the participants in this morning's seminar is that CEO founders are worse at it. And, that question of royal court, I love that. I'm going to steal that from now on. But question of royal court comes to play. Maggie?
Yeah, I was just going to say almost similar to what you said, Mark, is I've been involved with technology companies who have been around a long time. And it's same with very tenured leaders that get promoted to CEO in a company, right? They have a lot of loyalty of people that they know in the company as well. And they're very indoctrinated into a culture that was founded by founders. So it's not just the founder CEOs. I do think that when you have succession planning and you have a culture that is very incestuous versus open to new ideas and bringing people in that can challenge that status quo, it can breed trouble, whether it's a founder CEO or not. And I do think that board members, to Christine's point, which is the right question, what can we do about it? I do think she's right. Exposure to the senior leadership team, spending time with those leaders one-on-one in between meetings. And I always let CEOs know when I'm going to do that. But I think from a succession planning perspective, it's the right thing to do to know where the high potential talent really is, or where people have been outgrown in those jobs.
Sure.
And that gives you an opportunity to also have one-on-ones with your CEO about maybe moving that person to a different type role or bringing in someone else. I think part of the the challenge is you wind up bringing people in as a CEO, but you're really not committed to their success because you just expect them to find their way. And that never happens. So having a real crisp onboarding process for senior executives in a company, having a mentor coach on the board. I've done that with several companies that are founder led. And having the CEO understand what you need for growth versus loyalty. And I think blind loyalty isn't good. Loyalty is important, but making sure that they understand that difference. And the trade-offs are, will you grow or not? Will somebody else take your money river away from you if you don't have the right people in the right seats on the bus? And that as the bus continues to move forward, sometimes the people on the seats change. People have to get off at stops and other people have to get on. So one of the other things.
I love the idea of coaching up the CEO, preparing the soil to receive the new people.
Yep.
Them support and structured from the board level. But Maureen, you were going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to ask, how common is that? I mean, that directors meet with senior management. It seems like a really healthy thing. I would imagine even that most CEOs would be a little wary of that. Maybe not. I don't know. I'm curious.
I think it's fairly common, but it takes time.
Yeah.
It takes time and commitment. I must admit, I sort of challenged myself to do more of it when I'm a lead director. But I think the thing that I wanted to follow up also with Maggie is the coach, and Mark, what you said. I think the coaching is really important. The reality is, if you look at the companies going public today, more and more of them are founder driven. More and more of them in technology have dual class stock and control. And you have less of them necessarily moving on. So I think this is an important element as to what's going on, particularly in technology companies, and not so much in private equity, but in technology companies. And so I think, to find ways might be a good thing to discuss at various director colleges in terms of board and education, how to manage through this process, because it is a trend going on, particularly in the technology companies I view. And there's a number of companies I can think of. We all know them. Actually, Amazon had just now had a succession plan, but how many years did it take? Google Alphabet had it, relatively recently. Others still being driven by very hard-nosed, hard-charging CEOs. And I think it's an important element to think about how do you think about the trends and how do we think about it in various board education sessions, which, by the way, I go to from time to time when I have time, and they're very helpful in terms of some of the sessions you go to. But I think this is going to be a greater subject going on, is how to deal with it, because the trend is increasing, not decreasing.
Yep.
Yeah, I would also say when you form committees, and I actually am a big proponent that private companies should have committees like public companies do, to look at the financials from an audit perspective, to look at human capital management and compensation, and to look at how, and the board itself can actually function as a nom and gov committee on the governance of the company. But that also allows us to have access to other employees that are senior leaders in the company. And partnering with those leaders as well, especially on the human resource side, the talent side. One of the things that on the private boards I sit on, we like to look at regrettable turnover. How much turnover is there in a company? Are we bringing great people in and they're not staying? And that allows you to have data-driven conversations about people, which are emotional subjects anyway. So I do think there are ways for us to put processes in place that allow for that check and balance.
I'll just say, in terms of HR, one of the things I feel like I've figured out more recently, but in terms of seeing red flags at big companies, like networks, there's like a whole network of HR people, and just in terms of my own sourcing, what they see, and they're ethical people like so many other people, and I think it's just interesting when there's red flags and feel like they can't. When HR people feel very powerless, maybe.
It's interesting. One of our clients is on their third head of HR in the last 14 months. And I say one of our clients, that's the canary in the coal mine, isn't it?
Mhm.
Well, that's a discussion that should be had with that CEO.
Yes, that's right.
By a board member.
But to your point, it's very emotional and
It
it's very much data driven, right? It's got to be something that people are willing to engage on and talk about. And that's not always the case. Let's change subjects a little bit if we can and talk about just a mechanical question. And Ken and Christine, I'm going to look to you guys more than anybody. You sit on private companies, you sit on public companies. When somebody had voting control of a company in 2014, a public company, it was usually because they had Dcso, witness Evan Spiegel and others. When people have, voting control of a public company today, it's very seldom because of special voting rules or restrictions that were put in place. It's usually because they own more than 50% of the company. Thank you very much. Now the question is, how did it get that way? Like, as private companies, is that about the valuations that these folks are getting as private companies? Is that likely to sustain? Is this really the future, that CEOs will have voting control of the companies that they run?
Mark, I think it's actually, I'm not sure I agree with you. I think it's because of dual class stock, either 10-1, 20-1. I think in the case of, if I remember, Snap, the public shareholders had no votes, if I remember correctly. I think it's because of dual class stock. And I just looked at one of the questions. Some of these provisions, usually these things are put in place, at least the companies I've been involved in, they're usually put in place before the company goes public. We think about what are the various, honestly, we haven't talked about it, various, ways against activists, so to speak. And so you can run the company. Many of them have sunset provisions, 7 years, 10 years. Some do not have sunset provisions. More of the recent ones do have sunset provisions. And if they do not have sunset provisions, do you think about changing that? Do you think about extending the sunset provisions? All of those are very relevant discussions. But when we would have law. I've been involved, and I'm not going to talk about because Maggie's going to have more than me. But a number of companies that have gone public, I've been on the private board, and one of the key discussions we always have with outside counsel is thinking about our various, governance provisions.
Yeah.
Whether it's dual class stock, whether it's poison pill kind of things or whatever. And so that's when you really have heart to heart on many of these control-oriented situations.
Yeah, and I also think that with dual class stock, if you don't put a sunset in place right away, it is something that can be revisited with the founder who who has that dual class stock and then takes a company public. You will start to get the investor base that are their public investors putting pressure on them too, on dual class versus one for one.
Pressure on them for what purpose?
Well, because they have voting control versus having that control for a period of time, and then actually looking at other investors as being important in major decision process as well, because you have annual voting on specific issues. And the other part is classified boards, right? That's another big piece. A lot of private companies have a classified board when they go public. So it's a third over 3 years. So you don't have these hostile takeovers. And most of the institutional investors in tech that invest in tech will give companies a break for usually a 7 to 10 year window on a classified board. But then you'll start to see pressure as well to declassify that board.
It's interesting, Maureen, in your book, yours and Elliot's book, you talked about Aaron being willing to give up, Adam being willing to give up voting control only when the company was in terrible trouble and when he essentially got a payoff in order to give up his voting control. Is that the future as well?
Yeah, I wonder about that. I mean, I guess it was pretty amazing, as you said. It was, at the last moment when no investors were going to buy in, and it was so extreme. But it just seems like, broadly speaking, I mean, covering IPOs, especially after WeWork, I mean, I'll just give one example, is Palantir. We were covering that, and I mean, it took a lot of like reading the S1 and just being like, are we seeing this right? Elliot, my co-author, and I were working on the story together. Like, is this really what it was? And we talked to lawyers and others, but that basically they got the right, the co-founders of Palantir, to have no basically sell almost all of their stock. And I don't know if this changed a little bit at the last minute, but retained full voting control. And we wrote a story about it, and I don't know, some people paid attention. It obviously didn't matter for the stock. I haven't looked recently, but the IPO went well. Or direct list, no, IPO, and it didn't, it hasn't really affected it. But I mean, I guess in terms of the future, it seems like as of right now, it doesn't, investors don't seem to blink an eye too much. And I do think, to your question, Mark, with Adam, I mean, ultimately to give up his voting control, it was to the tune of, $1 billion plus payout to get him to relinquish these shares. And I mean, I think it's still going to be.
Similar stories could be told at places like Zynga and others, places where the founders were in effective voting control indefinitely, until honestly things went so badly that was their way out. And they had some economic incentive to do that. I don't know.
Mark, back to your question, your original question about how did this happen? How did the, especially in public companies, how did the founders retain so much stock, and what do you do about it? So I think you hit on it. It's valuation. So for a long time, valuations were pretty high. So the founders were able to end up owning, 40% of the company, even after the company went public. So what do you do about it? You're sitting on the board of directors. The founder CEO owns 40% of the stock. And especially in small to mid cap companies, you're not going to have the dual voting control. But what you will have is you will have investors that are discouraged from coming into the company because they look at the CEO's ownership and they say, this company is going to be run by one person. The directors won't be able to have any independent influence on them. Why would I want to invest in such a company? And when that starts to happen, if you don't get new investors coming in, your market cap is not going to increase. So what do you do about it? One of the things I've seen done that was relatively successful was persuading the founder CEO to go out and do additional public raises, which diluted his ownership and brought in new investors into the company. And while we didn't have any particular use for the money, you can always put it towards acquisitions for the growth of the company. But yeah, it's difficult.
But it's an interesting question. We had that question of what the future looks like. 2 data points for what they're worth. One, many of you in the audience in particular are familiar with ISS. ISS has 100 rules, maybe 1,000 rules about board governance and board composition and how companies are run and how investors are informed. ISS has they've got policies on everything. They have suggestions on almost everything. Many of you know that ISS actually votes tens of millions of shares weekly on behalf of mutual funds and so on, based on their analysis of certain companies. ISS had absolutely no point of view on the subject of founder-led or DCO, no position at all, which is pretty interesting. It's not like this has been hidden from ISS, but they have chosen not to comment publicly on how board governance works inside of a public company. One other bit of data, and Christine, if you're right, and the valuations are at an all-time high, there's more venture capital money than ever. We had a client of ours at the end of last year that raised $550 million in its alpha round of venture capital on a $3.2 billion valuation. This is pretty much fun from really smart money if you do the math, you discover that the CEO handed away about 16% of his company in return for $550 million. Well, that's a pretty good thing, right? He has subsequently, that was his first round, his second round of capital. He now owns 68% of the company, and he's taken in well over $1 billion in venture capital. The question, he or she, in this case, he will have voting control of that company as long as he chooses to. That's just going to be the way it works out. And the good news is the company's doing well. But the key question comes down to, is that the right individual to run that company as a public company? That's a question that investors will have to answer. So the question I'm left with, and perhaps the people in the audience are left with, is this the future? Is this what the future looks like? And if so, how are boards going to have to morph to kind of match that future?
The only comment I was going to make, I don't know if that's the future, but I made an earlier comment. I'm just going to double down on it. I think the future, at least in technology, is more and more CEOs are going to have control one way or the other, either control because of ownership or control because of dual class, or the CEO and some of the early investors will have control. That also occurs, by the way. So it isn't just the CEO. And then there's different restrictions. If they sell down a certain amount or whatever, do they lose that control? But I think if I understand your question correctly, I think there is a greater desire for CEO founders to have, with their early investors, so to speak, in many cases, control privately and publicly, particularly in the public environment. And I think you'll see that particularly as a way. For those that in the cheap seats watching what went on with Box and Starboard and so forth, and seeing what happens in a public company when you don't have control, and then you have an outsider trying to basically have you fired as CEO.
Dude, an activist could, can have some impact. Maggie, what are your thoughts?
I was just gonna say, we're not gonna be able to predict the future, but what happens is we do live in a pretty litigious environment, right? You take these companies public, you have a very large shareholder in a founder or in a CEO. And as long as, it's all happy days, that's great. But when it's not happy days anymore, life gets pretty miserable in those environments because you spend a lot of your time in depositions or, the headlines in papers. So, and I think the concentration of power has always been something that our government is not really happy with, as we all know, from an anti-competitive perspective. So I do think there'll be concentration, as Ken said, with founders and with CEOs. I think boards have to try as best they can on check and balance on that. It is unusual for a palace coup when you have someone who has control, like what happened to Uber. It's, these are unusual situations, but that's also because there were several venture companies involved in that company that also had power. So the makeup of the board matters as well.
By the way, we got a question from the audience. The question was, what is Dcso? For those who aren't familiar, Dcso, dual class stock ownership. And in a Dcso company, there are at least 2, in some cases 3 or 4 different classes of voting that are given out according to the governance principles of that particular company, often stated in the S1 before a company goes public. So did I get that right? Dual class stock ownership?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you may have A, B. Sometimes companies have stock A, stock B, stock C. And a lot of times the B stock is the one that has extra votes. And in many cases, they have 10 votes per share. Sometimes I've seen 20. And in some cases, I've seen almost unlimited. Or in some other cases, I think I use the other example of Snap. They have, I think, at least when it went public, I think the public shareholders had 0 votes, if I remember correctly.
That's what we saw as well. So let me ask you, Maureen, the same question. We are all kind of denizens of the Silicon Valley, but you see the world, all of North America. What's your sense? Is this going to be true in Chicago and New York and Florida, or is it unique to our region?
I think it's more unique to tech companies. I just think there's the history and the power that they have, the history of, everyone still wants in on the next Facebook or whatever else it's going to be, and is willing to hand over control, sort of unfettered control, and not really push back. I don't think, a lot of companies like WeWork want to all be tech companies. I do not think it's going to be true for the average company. It seems like there's just two different paradigms, really. I don't see any true pushback. I think it's still this whole world is still governed by FOMO on the investor side. They just why push back? You're not going to be able to do anything about it, and why take the chance of missing out on the next big thing?
I think I said that earlier.
Yeah.
By the way, Maggie, you bring up an interesting point or a question. It's all well and good. The NASDAQ is at its all-time high. The Dow Jones average, almost any metric that you want to use, even the FTSE is near its all-time high. What happens when the NASDAQ drops by 50%? Interest rates jump up, into the 7-8% range. What happens when things go kitty-wumpus? Is it still kind of a happy world inside the founder-led companies? Is it, what's likely to be the nature of that dynamic when things aren't going as well as they are right now? Christine, what do you thought? Your thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say, Mark, I don't think it's just founder-led companies that will be unhappy with that.
Yep.
I think it's a very democratic unhappiness across the board. But what it does is it does separate, the wheat from the chaff. You're going to have certain companies that know how to deal with adversity and have, tenacity and grit to work through it, and have more long-lasting business models than quick money into companies. And I think the other thing is, all boards today need to look at their capital structure. Do they have enough capital to work through a problem that could take place for several years as companies have to restructure, or as, revenue falls? We've all been through a pretty tough time from a pandemic perspective with haves and have-nots. Right? A lot of companies in the travel business. I sit on a couple boards that are in the travel business, and losing 85 to 90% of your revenue in a couple weeks is a sobering moment for boards, and a sobering moment for founders and for the employee base. And working through that is tough.
I'm actually thinking about, like you, I read the egregious S1 that WeWork filed. I read the S1 that Evan Spiegel filed. These are outrageous terms, but for the most part, these companies have done okay, right? So nobody's mad at those folks. Google has done well, Netflix has done well. They're all kind of founder-led companies. I'm just wondering how people are going to look at those same dual stock provisions when the stock is now trading at 20% of its previous level. I would imagine that the level of outrage, at least the level of public perception, is going to be dramatically different than it is right now. That's just a guess. I don't know. Maureen, am I off on that?
No, I think you're right. And there was as we talked about, there was a snap for a while, and but giving him having that power, Evan, he was able to ride through it. But yeah, I think there is a lot of frustration, but there is also kind of throwing up your hands. It almost feels like some of these companies, when you mentioned Zynga before, it's like that. I remember that company. It was it was kind of the first one in this true hype machine. I vaguely remember the CEOs of the major banks going to pitch to do the bake off to lead the IPO. It was the hottest company ever, and then it fails, and yeah, people are frustrated, but what can you really do with it? You mentioned lawsuits and litigation, Maggie, but if those, you just kind of get trapped in that. It doesn't really,
Yeah, I have a hard time when companies are named after the founder's dog. That's a problem for me.
Good warning sign.
Good dog. I actually met that dog and it was a good dog. So
And everybody who worked at Zynga brought their dogs to work.
yes,
So
they did.
you can tell there was a lot of work going on at Zynga.
Some of them were house trained, and unfortunately, several of them weren't. We've got 5 minutes left. I'm deeply cognizant of your time as a panel, but also the audience's time. I'm anxious to get final thoughts, and I'm anxious to hear from you on, what you would advise members of our audience today in terms of how to think about their board service when you've got a founder that you're dealing with, maybe things that they could do to kind of make themselves more attractive to founders, more positive in terms of their impact with founders. Christine, I'll start with you.
I think one of the things that's important is to understand the difference between a professional CEO and a founder CEO. Founder CEOs tend to have, I think somebody mentioned it before, something called founder courage. They have the long view. They have fought through many battles. They understand tremendous amount vertically about their companies, the competition, the technology, etc. However, they in general have not developed a wide view that a professional CEO would have. And in many cases, not only are they the founder CEOs are somewhat business immature, they can be personally immature as well. So I think it's important to understand and respect the founder CEO's intelligence and to explain things to them. Whereas you have a professional CEO, there's a little bit of business shorthand that goes on. Yeah, this is the EBITDA multiples for our business. We can expect that. When are we going to achieve that? It's important to explain to the founder CEOs who often don't understand that, why that's important, what it means, and what they can do to help lift the valuation of the company. Founders are not fools. And if you take the time and show them the respect and explain things to them, I think it will be appreciated.
Yeah. So Maureen, what are your thoughts? Advice to board members?
I guess just on a very broad level, and this is board members, but also investors. I mean, Ken, you mentioned this early in the panel that there's a big difference between dual class shares and founder control in the private markets and public markets. And I mean, and Mark, the example that you just gave about the three, the Series A round, just seems like be tougher on. I mean, it's easy for me to say, but this whole like founder friendly notion seems very dangerous, especially in the public markets. Why give away any power so early on? And I mean, I think it's hard when it's like, if you don't do it, someone else will come in. The founder wants this, and there's so much money out there chasing deals. So if venture capital firm A doesn't do it, venture capital firm B will. But it seems overall dangerous and kind of unhealthy for the ecosystem in the private markets in particular. So I don't know. I just advise you all to keep your power. I mean, you have the you all have the knowledge base that the CEO needs, even if they don't know that they need it, and to have more mechanisms in place to let you have more power and more of a say in many different ways seems important.
You bet. Maggie, what are you thinking?
I think power is knowledge. And I think building relationships with individuals and building trust allows that knowledge to be acknowledged by a founder CEO. I also believe in talking about the downside risks and what consequences are for different actions. So they have full view of making decisions that shouldn't just be emotional. They should be rational decisions for creating long-term value. And I think that it's not a one size fits all. I think we all have to understand that everyone's an individual. They come from different backgrounds, different places. But the one common denominator is they want to be successful.
Yep.
And what you have to do is help them define what success really looks like at different stages for their company. And as I said, you ask questions, you give them optionality, you give them time to process and think through. And then you also get to see how they make decisions, both when they're small and as they get larger. And the other thing is to make sure they surround themselves with great people that have capabilities that they don't have. And I think that's the role that boards should play in those environments.
And that last topic of surrounding themselves with really good people, sounds like that's a constant challenge. Ken?
Yeah, I wrote some things down. I said, first of all, I would say don't be afraid to join founder-driven companies. Learn to keep your emotion out of it. Emotion can be your worst thing possible. Think about how to balance everything. Think about where your true north is. I mean, when you take a real strong stand and not. Realize ultimately you have your mutual service to the shareholders, and that's your compass, if you will, and how they think. I think it's better to join a company when it's private if you have a choice than public, because you get to learn the company in a sort of private setting and before it's public, and there's less quote unquote pressure on you in terms of making decisions. So, and you're not in a glass bowl. So I think I have found that it's a lot better for me when I join as private. And I'm going to add something that Maggie just said. You have more power by personal persuasion than you think. Power is sort of an interesting concept. You can have various power if you're, politically, whatever, but, so much power comes from logic, your personal persuasion, credibility, and you'd be surprised. And the same in negotiation, by the way. If you think about negotiations, you can have a lot more power than you think by just persuasion and logic and facts. And even though someone may, in theory, have more control, you'd be surprised at how moral suasion and persuasion really affects quote unquote power.
I understand. Well, look, I wanted to thank the four of you as my panelists today: Ken Goldman, Maureen Farrell, Maggie Wilderrader, and Christine Russell. You guys have been amazing. And as always, I wanted to thank Nancy Easterbrook, who runs, I think, one of the most innovative and interesting organizations in Silicon Valley. Thank you, Nancy, for putting all this together for us. And more details, look on our website, Lonergan Partners, look on the SDDX website. We will be publishing blogs and written materials, including that survey information for everybody's benefit. So thank you all for taking the time with us this morning, and looking forward to hearing from all of you in the future. Take care.
I'm amazed you said it was the largest panel you've ever had, largest group you've ever had, Mark. I think you said earlier.
Yeah, I like being in the foxhole with all of you. Take care.
Thank you.
All right, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care.